Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to go over some ways of creating explosions with Phoenix FD in 3ds Max. This is just a quick example that I rendered out last night just to give you a rough idea of what you can do. So when you're in Max, make sure that you're in units, meters, and 1 unit is 1 meter. The scale definitely matters, so if you're going for a large scale simulation, it's easier if you just work in large units. So the easiest, simplest way to get an explosion going is to use one of these presets. So you would just go under Create, Sphere, Auto Grid, and just make a sphere in the middle. Make sure that it's sitting a little higher above the ground like this. And then you can just, you have two presets here. You have the explosion sim and then you have the gasoline explosion. So we're gonna go with the standard explosion first, so just click that and it will automatically create a source and the simulation box for you, and I rendered out a preview for that too. So this is exactly what you get when you use the preset, and I think it's actually pretty good. I must say that the presets are really well done. You have liquids here, you have honey, blood, paint, waterfall, and a lot of times if you're not sure which settings to input, it's great to just create a preset on the side and then work on your own simulation here, and then you can always go back to the preset and look at what settings they used to make something like these effects. So basically after you create the preset, the only thing that I would do is go under Grid and increase the resolution, so maybe get about 6 million total cells, and then you would just go under Output and select where you want to simulate this into, and then you would just go under Simulation and hit Start. So everything's working as it should, and basically without any work you're getting a pretty good explosion to start with. This is very low res. I lowered the settings again just to get you guys this preview faster. Now if you want to get this kind of a nice preview, you would just go under Preview and select GPU Preview Enabled, and that will give you basically this shaded view instead of just seeing the particles like this, which is really nice. If your preview is slow, then you can just go under Detail Reduction here and increase the reduction, which will just kill some of the detail, but it'll make it much faster to scrub and see what's happening. If you want to control how bright the fire is and the opacity of the smoke, you would go under Rendering, Volumetric Options, and here under Fire, you can play with the fire multiplier, which will make it, brighter or less bright like this. And under Smoke Opacity, you can increase that as well to make the smoke look much thicker. And we're gonna go over these settings in more detail in just a second. So this would be the super basic setup that you can render out and get a pretty good looking explosion that looks like this. And obviously you can add some contrast in After Effects. So in After Effects you could just go under Effect, Color Correction, Curves, and just give it a little bit more contrast like this. Already it's looking nicer. So you get something that doesn't look too bad to start. Alright, so I also want to show you how to set this up from scratch without the preset so you understand how everything works. So again, we would just go and create a regular sphere, and then you would go under Phoenix, Fire and Smoke Sim, and create a grid around the sphere like this. So under Grid, you would raise the resolution for your final simulation, but when you're just setting things up, leave this low so you can see if everything's working and it doesn't take forever. You want to set Z as jammed minus so that the bottom will act as a ground and the fire will interact with the ground. And then we want to set adaptive grid by smoke, which means that if the smoke reaches the edge, it will automatically expand. Just like you can see here, this was our original grid. The pink and the green is the adaptive grid, which is expanding because the fire has reached the edge here, which is a great little feature. So let's go over the dynamic settings a little bit. Gravity, pretty obvious. Timescale, if you wanted some kind of a slow motion or bullet time effect, you could animate the timescale to lower or speed up over time to control the speed of the simulation. Cooling controls how fast will the temperature lower over time, and temperature here controls the fire and how quickly it's rising. So you could raise this up, and over time basically the fire would die off. Smoke dissipation controls how much the smoke disappears over time. Smoke buoyancy controls the rising or the falling of the smoke. So you can set this to a negative value and the smoke will just fall down, kind of like dry ice. Or you can raise it up to make it rise up even higher if you wanted to. We're gonna leave this at 0. Massive vorticity controls these big sort of swirls in the smoke. So these big plumes and how much they break up is controlled by the massive vorticity. So it's just something that you'll have to play with to get the kind of look that you're after. And the large scale value only goes from 0 to 1, and basically 1 means that it's the most large scale looking as it will get, and then you just control how big things look by how fast they move and how big your object is. So I could make this sphere huge, and obviously I would get a much larger looking smoke because Phoenix knows how big this sphere is in relation to the scene units. So scale is really important when it comes to these simulations. For the conservation, you can leave it at default, which is direct symmetric. You can pick PCG symmetric, which will just give you a little nicer detail. And the quality by default, it's 8, and by raising this value up to about 200, you can get some much nicer swirls and detail in the smoke, and it will also make the smoke last longer. So this is an important value to play with. And steps per frame, you can leave at 1 because there's no interaction with geometry. But if there was an object that the explosion was hitting, for example, then you would want to increase this value just to make sure that you capture all of that detail. So in this example, the burning is actually disabled. There is no fuel, and we're just telling Phoenix, hey, I just want you to render the temperature as fire. But there is no fuel right now to speak of. In this particular example, we're just rendering temperature to look as fire. In this gasoline example, there is fuel here, so we're gonna get to that in a second. Alright, so now we need to create the source to tell Phoenix that we want to essentially emit the explosion out of this sphere. So you would just go under Helpers, Phoenix, and create a PHX source, and just select this sphere here. And it's always good to just name it emitter. So you can set noise to 1, which will just help break up the fire as it's being emitted. It will basically give some variation to the outgoing velocity. And now we need to animate the outgoing velocity. So you would just enable auto key and set this to 600, set a keyframe, and then go a few frames forward and set this back to 0 and set a keyframe. So it goes from 600 to 0 over about 7 frames, and that will give you the explosion that we need. Alright, so now let's move forward and create this gasoline explosion, which uses fuel as the source for the fire. So again, the easiest way to make this is just to create a sphere, move it up above the ground a little bit like this, and then you can just select this Phoenix FD gasoline explosion preset. And then again, you could just go under output and select where to sim this into. Alright, so everything's working great. This is a really beautiful preset. I mean, I haven't changed almost anything. I just rendered it out. And this is the kind of explosion that you get just with the preset. So it's a really nice starting point. So I'm just going to set it up on the side from scratch again so you can see how it's put together. So again, let's just create a sphere and then go under Phoenix and Fire and Smoke Sim and drag out a grid just like the example. Grid, and set the adaptive grid by temperature this time. And we can set the threshold to about 600 and set the Z as jammed minus again so that the floor acts as the floor. And let's go under Helpers, Phoenix, and create again a PHX source. And let's add our emitter here. And let's animate the outgoing velocity to go from about 800 meters at frame 0 to 0 on frame 1. We want to set the noise to 10 just to get a lot of breakup and detail. And then you can disable temperature, disable smoke, and enable fuel. Because what we're doing right now is we're just going to create fuel and set it on fire, and the fuel will then create the smoke, unlike the previous example where we just emitted temperature and smoke and the temperature was rendered as fire. So these are two different techniques, but I think that creating the fuel creates a little nicer result. All right, so under dynamics, we want to set the cooling to 0.3 so that slowly the fuel will cool down, just like you can see here. It kind of lasts for a long time rising up, but it's slowly disappearing. So this is controlled by the cooling parameter. And you can set the smoke surface vorticity to maybe 0.4 or 0.5 just to get some nicer detail. And the quality here, let's set that to 50 and change the method to PCG symmetric. Under fuel, we need to enable burning. And basically the default temperature inside of the Grate is 300 Kelvin. And 300 Kelvin is room temperature, meaning that nothing is going up or down. It's just basically zero gravity. So if I set the ignition temperature to just under 300, so maybe 290, it means that the fuel, if it's above this threshold, will reach ignition temperature and be able to be ignited. So you want to set this to about 290. Then since I've already done this, I know that the energy is a little too much. The energy is basically kind of like expansion. If you've ever used VFX, it basically controls how much force the fuel has when it's ignited. So we want to set this to 5. Fuel depletion is basically the rate at which the fuel burns out. So we can set this to something a little lower, like 0.8, just because it's really nice how it slowly burns out. The smoke amount we can set to 0.5 just so there's not too much smoke. And the smoke threshold controls how much of the fuel is turned into smoke as it burns out. The higher this value, the less smoke is generated. So let's set this to 1. And the propagation here is an interesting parameter which basically controls how much the fuel will expand. So if you're getting something that just looks like a big sphere, then lower this value and it will give you more of that breakup into all sides. So you get this nice detail instead of just getting a big ball. All right, under output, since we're generating fuel, we need to enable the fuel grid output channel. And then under preview, we can disable everything here and just enable the beautiful GPU preview. And for now, we can just make sure that everything's working and hit sim. All right, so I simulated a few frames. Again, this is the preset and this is our explosion that we just made from scratch. So they're almost the same. The only thing that's different right now is the shader because we haven't touched it yet. So you would just go under rendering, volumetric options, and we would want to just play with the opacity curve here for the fire. So basically the way this works is you just double click to make a point and then you can drag that point up and down. And you can see how it's changing the opacity of the fire. So basically the way to get the nicest results is just to make a bunch of points and give it some contrast. So at fire opacity mode fully visible, it will basically always render at full opacity. So we want to change this to use own opacity. And now you can play with the physically based slider here, which will control basically how much the fire is blended into the smoke, so to speak. So you can see it kind of turns orange, which is a really nice effect. So I would set this value to maybe 0.9. And then you can play with the opacity multiplier itself for the fire to get some nice detail that way. And you can also play with the fire multiplier, which essentially is a master multiplier for the entire brightness of the fire like this. So that way you can get some really nice results. And under smoke color, you can just change the constant color to something darker to create more contrast. And then under smoke opacity, we can just raise the smoke opacity to get some different effects that way. So this is something that you can play with. It's completely up to you for what will look good for your scene. And then let's go back to the fire, and here you have the light power on scene. So let's transition into talking about rendering a little bit. You can just go under create, standard, and just create a plane as our ground under the explosion. And let's give it a standard vray material, just something gray, and maybe let's make it a little darker. So Phoenix FD is developed by Chaos Group, which is the same company that makes vray. So you're going to get the best and fastest results if you render your Phoenix sims with vray. So under rendering, you would just select vray as your renderer. And then what I like to do is switch the type to bucket and just do 2 4 min subdivs, 4 for max. And then under GI, you can just do 1,000 subdivs for now. And then if you want to reduce the noise, you can raise this to about 2,500. And then you can maybe do 3 and 6 for these subdivs. But for now, let's just leave this at 1,000. So I rendered out a frame just to show you how the explosion fire will automatically illuminate the environment around it. And you can control how much this is happening or how much light it's emitting under that light power on scene parameter. So if we make this 2 and render again, you can see that much more light is being emitted from the fire and onto the environment. One of the best ways to render explosions and stuff like this in general is to do it in passes. So you would go under render elements, click add, and add the vray atmosphere, and atmosphere in this case will be the smoke, and then vray self illumination, which will be just the fire. So you should have these 2 render elements in here. And then of course you want to add some light. So you would just go under lights, vray light. And usually just 2 lights are enough. So you can make the multiplier about 2.5 and put this one on the other side like this. And then you can just select the light, go under options and make it invisible for both of them. And then you would just set your camera in place, and what you'll end up with is something like this, where you can see the one light here and the other light is illuminating it from the other side. So after you render it out, just import everything into After Effects, and you should have your self-illumination pass, your atmosphere pass, and your basically beauty pass. So just select the beauty pass and make a new composition, and it should look something like this. And then, I mean, you can just hide that and drag in the atmosphere pass and the vray self-illumination pass. So basically the self-illumination pass is just the fire, and the atmosphere pass is essentially the beauty pass again. So you can just select the mode as add on the self-illumination on the fire. So this way you have the fire on top as a separate layer. And you can hit T for opacity and lower the opacity to about 50. And then we can go under Effect, Stylize, Glow, and just give the fire some glow. So you can raise the radius, and then you can play with the threshold to affect how much brightness it's gonna give you. And you can set the glow colors to AB colors and make one of the colors maybe like a light orange and the other one like a much darker sort of fiery orange color. So this is what we're getting. It's subtle, but it's nice. And then you can select the smoke pass, go under Effect, Color Correction, Curves, and just give it a nice curve to add some contrast, which really makes it pop. And then what you should end up with is something like this. Now in the beginning it's a little too bright, so what I would do is just go under the glow, and you can animate the intensity. So I would maybe just set a keyframe for the opacity to be where I liked it here, but then it's too bright here, so you can just lower the opacity back to 0. And then what you can also do is select Shift T, so you can see both the intensity and the opacity, and you can just animate the opacity to go from 0 to 100 as well, or from 0 to 50. So the opacity is 0 wherever it's too bright, so maybe here, and then over time the opacity raises to 50, which is just the fire layer, so it adds some nice brightness over time. So you can see all this little detail in the smoke. So this is some super basic compositing. Just wanted to show you how to render out the passes out of vray. Now one more thing I want to show you before I go is the Rgb mixing of the colors of the smoke, even though I already made a separate tutorial for that, but I kind of want to give you everything in this one. So let's just hide the grid for now and select the sphere, and let's just go under here and create a new map under diffuse and make it a checker. And let's give one of the colors maybe like a dark gray, and the other color let's make it brownish. So maybe like a dirt brown color like this, and then you can just apply that checker to the sphere, show map in viewport. So you have basically 1/2 gray, 1/2 brown, just for this example. And you can copy the map and go under this fire source, enable RGB, and instance the map into the RGB slot. And then let's unhide our Phoenix grid again. Under output, you want to enable RGB. And then under rendering, you would go under smoke, color, and set this to based on RGB. So now that you've made these changes, you have to run the simulation again to see what's happening. And also what you gotta do is go back under the source and enable smoke. And then you have to go under the dynamics fuel and set smoke amount to 0. So this way the smoke will be emitted straight from the beginning and it will not be created by the fuel. The smoke that's created by the fuel is black or just the color that you give it under the rendering options. But if you want to emit smoke that's colored from the beginning, you have to do it through the source. So now you can see that everything's working, and basically half of the smoke is gray and half of it is that dirt orangey color that we gave it. So I hope that you guys found this helpful. I hope that you got a lot of tips out of this, and that if you were ever intimidated by making explosions with Phoenix, you can see that it's really super simple. I would say that it's definitely much easier than with VFX. I mean, making something like this with VFX is pretty difficult. There's a lot of parameters, while with Phoenix you only change a few things and you get something that looks pretty good, which is why I love this software so much. So thank you guys very much for watching. As always, if you're new to the channel, be sure to check out some of the other 40 tutorials that I have. I'll be making more, so be sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss out on any of the future content. As always, I would appreciate a thumbs up, and I'll talk to you later.